So we made it to the beginning of week 3. I don't know how you've been finding it. It's tough going. Reading, 3 chapters a day actually takes a little while. But what we'll find as we continue to press on with this is that God will speak to us. And that's why we're doing it. We'll find that our relationship with Jesus grows and it deepens. There's a scene in the Chronicles of Narnia where Lucy returns to Narnia for the first time in many years. And she sees Aslan and she says to him, "You're bigger." And he says, "That's because you are." And she says, "What? Not because you are?" And he says, "No, child. What you'll find is that every year you grow, you will find me bigger." And what he's kind of hinting at there is that as we mature in the faith, it's not that God becomes smaller and we understand him, we get our heads around him, as it were, but actually the more we get to know God, the more he expands beyond us. And what we'll find is, even though it can feel sometimes a little repetitive, reading Mark, who repeats a lot of the stories about Jesus that we found in Matthew and a lot of the kind of the same events, it can feel repetitive on one level, but actually as we ask the Holy Spirit and as we immerse ourselves once again in the story of Jesus, Jesus grows and he expands before our eyes. We know him better. A few things that Mark is particularly kind of drawing out of Jesus. One is he shows that the action of Jesus, the strength of Jesus. So Jesus is doing miracles left, right, and center in Mark's Gospels. 17 miracles in 16 chapters. Most of those happen in the first 10 chapters. And you see the strength of Jesus and the power he has to transform somebody's life in one encounter. And I have to remember that when I come back to kind of putting myself before him every single day, that one encounter with Jesus can transform me and it can transform the people around me. Another thing we see in Mark's Gospel is we see the way that Jesus is moving rapidly. Like there's an urgency. I don't know if you felt that as you're reading the story, but that's partly the language that Mark is using. So he uses this word immediately that is sometimes translated at once or straight away, and that occurs 43 times in the Gospel. It only occurs, which is more than the rest of the New Testament uses that word put together. So it's like super quick, and Jesus is on a mission. He's not going to be deterred from the mission. And yet at the same time, one of the things I love about Jesus is that although he's focused on his mission, also when people come and they interrupt him and they say, "Hey, Jesus, can you help me?" He will help them. I know when I get focused on something, it's usually to the exclusion of people. But when Jesus is focused on his mission, he understands that people are the mission. And so one of my favorite little stories that we've read over the last week was when Jesus was on his way to heal Jairus' daughter, and the woman with the problem of bleeding kind of like interrupts him in the crowd and sneaks up and grabs his cloak and is healed. And at that point he stops and he's looking for her, he has a conversation with her. Meanwhile, the little girl dies. And if I were Jairus, I would be like, "Jesus, what are you doing? We don't have time for this." But Jesus makes time for this woman who has a problem. And of course, then he raises Jairus' daughter from the dead. But one question I was thinking about in response to that story is, okay, where am I going, first of all? And secondly, who am I becoming on the way to where I'm going? There's an urgency about Jesus, but there's a love that just pours out of him to everybody who comes to him in need and comes to him for help. Is that true of you? Is that true of me? And then the final thing that jumped out at me, and we're going to see this over the next couple of days as we finish off the gospel, is the sacrifice of Jesus, the selflessness of Jesus. And what we see in the story of the crucifixion in Mark is that really Jesus is very, very, very alone in that moment. The disciples are not shown in a good light. Peter denies him. Judas betrays him. They all abandon him. The crowd that at one point are delighted in his teachings then start calling for his crucifixion. The Jewish leaders obviously want his death. The Roman soldiers are the one who carry it out. And even Jesus' father, in that moment when Jesus is dying on the cross, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It's this cry of despair and abandonment. And he chooses to go through the cross to lay down his life sacrificially for me and for you. And so it's worth, just as we read the next couple of days, contemplating that and doing so not simply to admire something distantly, but almost in friendship with Jesus, that you would do this for me, Lord. You would give your life for me.